Welcome everybody to our webinar. We're just admitting people in at the moment, and it's fantastic to see people joining us this morning to think about the really crucial issue under COVID in particular of how we get more small firms into public procurement networks. We ran this webinar yesterday specifically for Greater Manchester, which is our case study. And today we're thinking a bit more about the national and regional picture across the UK and what our findings can say to a range of people.
And we have Marilyn on the panel as well now.
Oh, that's fantastic. Welcome, Marilyn. So, Paula, I think, is it time that we start?
Yeah, let's. We're going to finish by 2 o'clock. So if we make a start now at 1 p.m, then people can just catch up with the introduction as we go. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. So welcome everybody to the Centre for Tendering's webinar on how can enterprise ecosystems enhance small business tendering capability. The challenge of how to get more small firms into public sector supply chains for the benefit of both those supply chains and small firms, it's been a long-running policy challenge. And in fact, if there are reports by bodies like the OECD as well, so it's actually an international challenge. Traditionally, we've thought quite hard about how public sector supply can become more simple, and that's certainly a part of the solution. In the Centre for Tendering, we think about that, but we also think about how we actually enhance the capability of small firms in developing public sector tenders. Let me give you a little bit of background into our business. As a day job, I am Professor Julia Rouse, and I have a role in the Decent Work and Productivity Research Centre at Manchester Metropolitan University. Paula worked alongside me there for a number of years, and she's the co-director of the Centre for Tendering. We first met when I hired Paula to help me write tenders, and she certainly got me out of a few corners and raised my capability in tendering. Paula then came onto the team, and then over a period of doing the arduous thing of a part-time PhD, as well as becoming a lecturer and an expert in small business learning, Paula conducted a PhD looking at how firms who are actually successful in tendering build their capability, because there was a real gap in the knowledge base. We knew that essentially small firms were not so good at tendering because it's resource intensive, but we didn't know how that minority of small firms who do manage to competitively tender put their resources to work in order to do so. And that's where we came up with the idea of Paula's PhD, which is about tendering capability. From that model, we decided to form the Clever Tendering programme, which is the basis of our fairly new business, the Centre for Tendering. And we then got this commission from the Productivity Insights Network, which is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, to think about how regions and the ecosystem of support in those regions can build the capability of small firms to tender. And it's this small study, taking Greater Manchester as a case study, that we're going to present today. So if we go on to the next slide. Just very briefly, for the first half of the seminar, we're essentially going to lay out our findings. We'll present our approach to reviewing the enterprise ecosystem in Greater Manchester and the Centre for Tendering's Clever Tendering model that we used in order to conduct that audit. And then we'll present a dashboard of priorities, which we hope will help regions to reflect on how they'll build capability to tender. We're joined today by a brilliant panel that I'll introduce in a moment, and there'll be a chance to hear their viewpoints, and we'll certainly collect up any questions or comments that you have, so please do use the comment box. Going to conclude by thinking about ideas for LEPs and business support providers and policymakers in terms of the kinds of business support you can commission in order to build capability to tender in small firms. So moving on, let's think about our panel. So you're going to hear from Dr. Paula Turner and myself, who run the Centre for Tendering. We're also going to hear from Dr. Marilyn Conry, who's a small business owner herself and is also involved in a really important initiative in Manchester, the Black United Representation Network, or BURN, that is helping Greater Manchester to think about how to economically empower its BAME community. And in particular, they're calling for 1% of public sector spend to be dedicated to BAME businesses. We'll also hear from Chris Townsend, who's a young entrepreneur running a thriving small digital business. He's managed to get some contracts from fantastic big brands in the private sector, but has found the public sector really quite tricky to penetrate. So we're going to hear some experience from Chris. And also from Peter Gaunt, who works for the Growth Company, our brilliant growth company in Greater Manchester, and can give us the wider ecosystem view, but also is a tutor on a specialist program called Step Into Healthcare that we're going to flag as better practice. So thank you to all of you for being on the panel today. And I should say that we are recording this session. So let's think about the next slide. Our project is also supported by an advisory group, and we've been challenged by them throughout this small project. This includes a number of business support organisations, local policymakers, people from the NHS, from the world of digital as well. It's important to say that they've actually said that they agree with the findings of our study, that they want to take them forwards and think about the enterprise ecosystem in Manchester. And so we hope we're onto something, and we're very much into the process of engaged scholarship and developing our findings with these stress testers out there in the field. So thanks to our advisory panel. So let's think now about Greater Manchester and the enterprise ecosystem. The government has said in the industrial strategy, or at least I think in the first draft of the industrial strategy, that we want to spend £1 in every 3 on procurement to small firms. So we're really keen to see that ambition. But what we also notice is a lack of real ideas about how to make that happen. There are ideas around, as we say, simplifying the procurement process, but we think even under Brexit, important principles that underlie tendering, such as transparency and fairness, are still going to be very important, and they're going to be important to trade deals as well. So tendering is with us, we think. And so the other half of the question then, and what we think is possibly missing from an industrial strategy, is a strategy for building the capability of small firms to tender for public sector contracts. Without that, we're undermining small enterprise growth and local economic development. And given that COVID, it's difficult to really overstate the effect of COVID on small firms and on local communities. This has made it even more important, I think, that we move towards building back better through more integrative thinking about how we use public sector spend and make sure that it does go to local small organisations. Because we're also inhibiting innovation and competitiveness in public supply chains if we don't include small firms and their innovative force. And we're wasting the scarce resources of small firms who try and fail in tendering. Now, we're worried about those firms that try again and never get there, and that waste. We're worried about the firms that really have got good potential but try once and then are discouraged tenderers, if you like. And we're worried about what we think is a really serious background problem, which is SMEs spending a lot of time getting partway through writing a tender and abandoning it. So we think that some of the waste isn't easy to see, but that this is pretty common in small firms. Our capabilities model will help them to triage opportunities so that they can look at tenders and make quick and good decisions about whether or not this is something they should go for. It'll also build their capability, which are kind of the preconditions of being capable to tender, so that at the moment when a specific tender hits, they are capable. So let's think about then Greater Manchester. The concept of an enterprise ecosystem, I think, is popular in policy terms and also in academic terms. What does it mean? For us, an enterprise ecosystem is a multilateral partnership of organisations who may not see themselves necessarily in partnership, but nevertheless, they all provide something of a service that enables or constrains enterprise in a given place. In terms of tendering, that includes, of course, business support services, and most principally in Greater Manchester from the Growth Hub, the 10 local authorities who both act as both business supporters and procurers, as do the 4 universities, 35 health and social care partnerships in Manchester, and then other public bodies like Transport for Greater Manchester, GCHQ, BBC, Manchester Housing Providers, the social housing sector. GM has a strategic and proactive commitment to its small business communities, but does it really have a strategy for using its own spend to develop those small firms? That was the challenge that we were talking about yesterday in the webinar. That's the challenge that I'd put out to other regions. Do you have a multilateral partnership of organisations, including these kinds of players, that will provide the value proposition of enabling small businesses to tender? We want to argue that a business support network needs to provide stated value propositions, and one of those value propositions should be building the capability to tender. So moving on, I'm going to pass over to Paula, and she's going to introduce you to our clever tendering model.
Yes, hi everybody. So you're looking at a diagram, a model of the clever tendering, which is essentially our conceptualization of what tendering capability looks like. And it's a model that we've developed through years of research by studying what successful small firms do. So we know tendering is complicated, we know it's resource intensive, we know it can feel alien to a lot of small business owners, even though they can be terrific at negotiating sales with blue sector, blue chip corps and the rest of it. But we also know that it's learnable because we've studied what the best firms do, and we've captured that learning in this model. So I'll just briefly talk you through the colour coding system, and it's just occurred to me, has anybody got colour blindness here? I'll direct you around the screen. But if you look on the right half where we have green sections, these are really what we call the preconditions or getting business ready to tender. So one of our arguments is that capability to tender starts way before an invitation to tender lands on your desk. It's really about making that strategic commitment to think about what you can bring to public sector spending and what kind of business processes and orientation you need to put in place. And then on the pink side of the diagram on the left, they are capabilities that speak to completing a tender response. And so if I just briefly explain what those capabilities are, and then I'll go through our findings in relation to Greater Manchester. So the first sort of business ready capability is about market analysis. And that's really about how you as a business discover opportunities, assess what the market demand and supply is for your particular product or service within a variety of public sector markets. Moving on and linked to this is about your market positioning. How do you strategically select the right kind of procurement bodies to engage with, how you build your market presence, and how you strategically think about what your offer can do, including safeguarding your market pricing within that. In terms of reputation building, that's about how you orient your business to be regulatory compliant, but also how you can do that in a way that showcases your innovation as well. So that would include things like looking at your policy families, potentially your accreditations, but also looking at how you can build your track record to really offer a competitive tender response. And these are all things that happen quite often before you decide that you're going to, you know, start orienting and winning a stream of public sector tenders. So moving around quickly, looking at scrutinising a tender response, how you really forensically examine what is in effect a legal and contractual document if you decide to submit a tender response. How you lead and coordinate a tender, and that's everything from project management through to how you can orient and bring in resources within your business, but also outside of your business through your wider community networks. And finally, how in the technical tender components section, you effectively cross the T's, dot the I's, and submit a really compliant, focused, formatted tender response within time. And you'll notice on the outside of the diagram and on the inside, there's 2 yellow circles, and they're what we call the dynamic capabilities. Pivoting to market or entrepreneurial orientation is really how you switch on resource construction within your business. And we've seen a lot of pivoting recently with gin companies making hand sanitizer and things like that. But also on the outside, learning and innovation, and how firms are enabled to find that strategic space, to reflect upon experience, and to really reinvest that knowledge back into business processes. So they're what we call the dynamic capabilities, and they, if you like, oil the wheels of the middle, the operational capabilities that exist. So let's now have a look at some of the findings from our study. And in the next slide, you'll see, so that what we've done is I've given you an extract of our report, which will be sent to everybody who's dialed into this webinar. We've done a fairly granular analysis of what happens at sector level, at regional level. What you'll see here is we've taken each of the capabilities. We've looked at some associated routines that serve that capability that happen within a business, and we've used a traffic-like system, sort of red, amber, green, to indicate what our findings show. So we've got in the blue section commentary on general findings for business support, and in the sort of paler peach section on the right, we've compared that to some better practice findings, some really good practice niche findings that exist within Greater Manchester as well. So you've got 2 lots there, and that's really just to show you, if you go through the report, you will have a really solid evidence base from this. But if we just quickly flick to the next slide, because that will give you a kind of an elevation of the findings from our report. So if we go back to some of the capabilities that I've described to you, I think our top level findings was that across the ecosystem, by going in as a small business, trying to navigate your way through different business supports, websites, procurer websites, it's a very fragmented customer journey with fairly poor knowledge flows. And again, the support that did exist was just about how to find a tender or how to complete a tender. It didn't really give you the overview of all of the steps in the process and the end-to-end journey that it involves. I think for many firms, there's a real challenge to know how you stack up against an opportunity and what your winnability factor might be. And there was little support really on the surface that had helped companies understand that leap in supplier value and what they needed to do to become more competitive. There were some great case studies around, small firms who service public sector contracts, but there was an idealization of regulatory compliance. And we all know that, small firms are the lifeblood of innovation. And there was little emphasis on how you could showcase that innovation. It was more about what accreditations were attached to a particular business. And I think for a lot of firms, and I alluded to the alien concept of tendering, a lot of really successful small firms who win tenders have got a leader or expertise from prior knowledge in bigger organisations. And so I guess it's how we overcome that tacit knowledge and look at making it much more explicit to somebody who hasn't done it before, who runs a small business. And in terms of the technical tender components, you know, there's little granular detail to kind of say, well, let's go through the process and practice looking at a tender together and understanding what that means. So on the next slide, if that was the general findings, the next slide shows you some really good examples of what happens in Greater Manchester. Rebecca?
Is that not the one that you want?
This is the one, thank you. So there was some really good and emerging models that's happening, driven by the Business Growth Hub in Greater Manchester. There's a new construction programme which takes construction associated firms through winning business within that sector. But the one I'm going to focus on here is one that's linked into small firms getting in as healthcare providers, and it's called Step Into Healthcare. And it's a really good example of a regional programme built to give a deep dive experience for small firms to think about supplying the NHS. So thinking about the dashboard red, amber, green system, here are some really good examples of practice that have been brought to bear. So participants on this programme are really well prepared to think about their value proposition and given time to think about market information needs and how they can both access public sector, NHS supply chains, where to look and how to position themselves within that. And I guess part of that is about thinking like a procurer and what that entails. It's the so what factor. And the really brilliant thing about that programme is there's panels of procurers there taking sessions, answering questions and really socialising the knowledge with a room full of business leaders at the time. And you'll hear later, Peter Gaunt from the Growth Hub is a tutor on this programme and does some great work about value propositioning as well. In terms of reputation building, you know, you do get the chance to hear directly from other small firms, not just about the success of them winning the public sector contract, but all about the resource demands it's placed upon their business and what they can do and what they had to do differently and more of and better. I think engagement with procurers does encourage a realistic assessment of opportunities that are within your reach. And on a much wider basis, what we did observe was that the voluntary and community sector in Greater Manchester, separate from Step Into Healthcare, did a lot of really good active lobbying and work for the sector organisations and ground level support to help them engage with tendering documents. So the summary is there's some very good ecosystem thinking, but this isn't available to most firms. So just to summarise from a learning perspective on the next slide. So to summarise from a learning perspective, I think that we all understand that, you know, small firms are, you know, learn through problems. And so it's very difficult to learn in the abstract. So if we can just have the next slide, Rebecca.
Sorry, I think there might be lag. I am on the next slide.
Thank you. That's great. So I think what we found is general provision just stops short of really raising absorptive capacity, that capability I referred to before, for firms to invest in learning and to know not only how to find information, but to assimilate and use that knowledge within the business. A wider finding is that there's some fantastic incubation space in Greater Manchester, some fantastic business growth programs, but in general, tendering isn't talked about. It isn't talked about selling to the public sector. So you tend to get workshops and sales and marketing, and it's really a lost chance to develop skills for competitive tendering, because many of those businesses on these growth programs are absolutely ripe to serve public sector contracts, especially now with COVID-19 and some pivoting towards public markets. Learning needs to be socialised more. There's less opportunity to really have a safety net, to try out ideas, to think about how you could answer a tender response. And we talk about stiff sanctions because you put a wrong comment on a form and it can be a reject. So really how we can move that forward. Both procurers I interviewed as well as other people, you know, acknowledge that the tender performance they give on an outcome is scant, the feedback is scant, but also that small firms don't ask for it a lot. And if you dig deep into our report, you'll see a lot of procurement comments who really want to support and engage small firms in a better way. And I think just to end on this, as an ecosystem, whilst there's pockets of good practice, there is a lack of method to diagnose where firms are at on their learning journey and how to offer the next support. So we've used that knowledge to develop a dashboard of priorities, and I'll hand back to Julia to talk you through that. Thank you.
Thanks, Paula. So we wanted to sort of lift the findings up from Greater Manchester and think about the implications for the whole of the UK, the way in which the devolved governments are run, and also the English regions. And we don't think that Greater Manchester is going to be massively different to other areas. Of course, it is different in some ways. But this perennial problem of lack of specialist provision to help small firms to develop tendering capability tends to be a national problem. I'm sure there may be some pockets of excellence. I know there's a new project run by Monderam going on in Birmingham that we're really interested in. But nevertheless, we think that this is a pretty much a national project, taking this forwards. How can we develop, through all the money we spend on business support and all the work we put into the procurement process, how can we use that and get much better value out of it by developing the value proposition of raising the capability of small firms to tender? So on the next slide, I can go into the 6 principles of our dashboard. The first one is to build absorptive capacity. So what's that? That's an academic term. Absorptive capacity is the ability of a firm to go outside of itself, identify knowledge that's useful, and crucially, use that knowledge back at base to enhance business processes or enhance products and services. How can we build absorptive capacity in small firms so that they are able to do this really quite significant change process, which is to develop the tendering capability? We think that what you need for that is strategic space. Small firms, we know, have a very needs-based learning process. They want to learn stuff that they need to know right now. They have what we call vulnerable compliance, so they only learn about 80% of what they need to be compliant, much of the time simply because of the sheer demands of learning. So we think we need some sort of human presence in small firms to encourage this strategic space. It's not going to happen necessarily very accidentally. We need to help to learn alongside them, including from their failure experiences. And in our research, we found that firms are pretty resistant to learning after failure, which is why they may not be asking for good feedback. So we need to find ways of giving that feedback and using that moment to reflect on why they haven't succeeded, in order that they can think about whether to either abandon the public sector as a market because they're not strategically committed to the process of tendering, or how they're going to do better next time. The second thing is to diagnose their learning journey. So we do need a toolkit to develop an understanding of who's where in the learning journey so that we can customize support to that process. We think there's need for a program that would build basic tendering readiness, and also other programs that would help to develop and hone tendering capability, so that once firms have got the basics, they can build better capability and ongoing learning processes. We need to create learning resources, not information. A lot of what is out there is flat, not very engaging, pretty technical, hard for a small business owner who I always think has probably got a glass of wine in one hand. It's 8 o'clock at night and they're pretty tired and they're thinking about how to develop their business. not easy for them to engage with that kind of learning. So we need to think much harder about the nature of resources and make sure these are learning resources that are engaging, that attend to the in the moment learning need of the small firm. We need to support tender readiness through coaching and peer learning. So our position is that although we think a diagnostic toolkit would be great, we would love to be commissioned to develop one, we think that needs to be provided alongside business support and coaching, possibly mentoring, that will enable small firms to go along the journey and to engage with the materials. Now that sounds expensive, but equally developing online resources that no one accesses is pretty expensive or wasteful, you might say. Allied with that, we think, is peer learning, perhaps a cheaper form of learning that could go alongside this, but also really crucially important, that firms get to buddy up, see each other's tendering processes, get to buddy up with people who are better at this than them, including larger firms, but also small firms. And that it's something they talk about in business networks. It's the kind of information that is exchanged in those business networks. Fifth, we think that essentially tendering is so demanding that it requires strategic commitment. So there does come a moment where, of course, we might introduce small firms to tendering, and there are, basic workshops out there for them to understand the basics of what tendering is and perhaps how you log on to a portal. But at some point, they need to decide, are they strategically committed to giving this a really good go? In garnering that strategic commitment, sitting alongside them and raising their confidence they can do that by offering the diagnostic journey, the coaching, the peer learning, etc., then we think we can garner their strategic commitment, because it will be a good business decision for them to give it a good go and to go on a journey with us. And finally, and this is the perennial thing, is it not, with small business support, we need to centralise, coordinate and intensively signpost resources. Paula spent weeks looking through the Greater Manchester ecosystem and found various resources. The chances that any small business owner is going to find all that Paula found is pretty low. And even then, they were pretty partial. But the other problem is that they're fragmented. So perhaps a quick to operate action point is to make sure that those resources understand how they speak to one another and that they signpost to one another. So on the next slide, what's next then? Before we go to the panel, I'm just going to outline what we think the Centre for Tendering could do next, that may help you to think about what your region could do next. So for anchor institutions, for procurers, for business support organisations and membership organisations, we could offer supply chain analysis and engagement services, which will help you to diagnose your enterprise ecosystem as we have done in Greater Manchester, and help procurers make tendering more SME friendly. For business growth companies and SME enterprise centres, there's a number of things that come out of our dashboard. We'd like to be commissioned to develop a digital incubator content, a diagnostic tool, training services for business advisors, a masterclass series, a learning process for small firms. We're wondering whether or not either ERDF or the equivalent as it comes through after Brexit could be a good place to find the money to do this kind of thing. For LEPs and business growth teams, there is that review of the ecosystem. As I said before, we could provide base reviews and reports around that work. So those are the things the Centre for Tendering would like to do, as well as ongoing research on what makes capability to tender in small firms. And we're interested to hear about your ideas going forwards. So next slide. Let's go to our panel now. If I ask them to unmute themselves and come onto video. This is the exciting bit where we trust the technology. Thanks very much. I'm going to come first to Marilyn. Marilyn, this was a small study and it stopped short of thinking about how particular groups of small firms can be served, but it's very evident that the BAME community may require some specialist support because they're not getting their fair share of public sector spend. So what are your thoughts?
I think that the COVID crisis presents a fantastic opportunity to reset the way that we do procurement, because I think procurement is going to be essential for BAME communities to survive the economic downturn that's expected next year. And rather than just being reliant on grants, if BAME organisations can actually win significant public contracts, that is a way of creating new jobs. So one of the things that we're looking at, Julia, is we're calling on the GMCA to ring fence 1% of the GMCA's annual budget, which is 8 billion, ring fence it for BAME organisations. That's £80 million that will be going into the BAME economy, which we estimate will create at least 2,000 jobs that can go to people who are on the lowest socioeconomic rung, and which tend to be BAME people and white working class people as well. So in that way, you can create better paid work to lift people out of poverty, especially at a time, especially a community that have been disproportionately impacted by the COVID crisis. So I see that as an essential way, and I would really call on government to experiment and pilot, because I was reading the government's report about the recovery plans and building back better, and there was a willingness to look at experimenting and piloting. So I would like Manchester to be that pilot area where we can show that we can do things differently, working with yourself and Paula to do that. I'm also, as you mentioned, I am the principal founder of an organisation called the Black United Representation Network, which is a membership organisation formed by 9 small businesses who've come together to say, let's share our knowledge, connections, competencies and capabilities to put ourselves in a great position to be able to win public sector contracts. We have great networks with the Institute of Directors, organisations like KPMG, and what we're saying to them is please partner with us, especially those organisations who are really good at winning contracts and public sector contracts. Partner with us to show us how it's done. We will be part of your framework, but we want to be included. At the moment, we're not even included in frameworks, which are a great way to introduce people to delivery of larger contracts. The other area is getting on to approved provider lists. So I think it's about demonstrating a willingness to do that. Often as a Black business owner, what you find is that organisations who are really good at winning public sector contracts come to us. I even had one this morning saying, we really want to connect with Black media organisations, community radio. Can you tell us who they are and where they are? And I said, yes, I could, but what's your budget for this? Because there's the expectation that we should do this for free. And I think that there needs to be an awareness that our skills and competencies must be valued, and the way that you value it is paying for it. The other thing that I would like to call for, which I think will be essential in order to get movement in this area, is the introduction of supplier diversity monitoring. At the moment, there is no monitoring of who is and are winning these contracts. We need to implement supplier diversity monitoring so that we can understand what are the barriers, who keeps winning it, understand why it is, and what is the impact. Because I'm part of the GM BAME social enterprise network, and yesterday we had a meeting and they were telling me that some of those businesses provide letters of support to larger organisations who then go on to win these contracts and they never hear from them again. So this is exploitation, and actually it's the lack of awareness of what impact that has on communities. What you're doing is further impoverishing those communities who just want, I mean, they put it this way, that actually they don't want the crumbs, they want to be able to come to the table and be able to share in eating the cake. So I think that those are 3 things that I'd like to see: supplier diversity, monitoring. I think there's another role for the growth hubs to facilitate and supervise those collaboration partnerships between organisations like ourselves and larger organisations, so that there isn't any abuse of the system, and that actually you do get to deliver some of these contracts. And I think social value could also be used as a way of engineering good behaviour. So companies have to demonstrate social value, and a great way of doing that is to say, we've partnered with a BAME business, a female-led business, an LGBT business, in order to submit this, this tender.
So those are brilliant ideas in there. So a lot of this relates to me back to our model. We're talking about providing support at the right part of the journey. We're helping BAME businesses to get into alliance with one another, to build the scale needed to tender together, but also to alliance with others who can perhaps be at the higher level of the chain, but also crucially support to move up that chain. So not just leaving them there at the bottom of the supply of the value chain, moving up the value chain towards being the lead tenderer. We're talking here about mentoring and coaching services, and the array of places those can come from. And we're also, and I think your point about monitoring and targets is really important. We need to be radical about this, and in the States they certainly have had targets, haven't they, around BAME businesses and women-led businesses, because there is a systemic problem that needs a systemic solution. So thank you very much for Marilyn. We look forward to working with you on all of that in the future. I'm going to come now to Chris. Chris, do you just quickly tell us a little bit about your business and your experience of trying to get into public supply compared with working with private suppliers?
Yeah, so I run a video and animation company that specialises in paid ads. We've been going for about 4 years coming up. The companies we've been sort of successful in winning work with companies from like the largest provider of visas for the J1 visa in the States. So they work directly with the American government. We've worked with Coca-Cola, Samsung, Vimto, Kellogg's, some real household names. And looked, as I say, it's never been a massive focus to look at tenders, but we started doing that about a year ago. And we have sort of suffered from that sort of feeling a bit discouraged by the fact that we've spent a lot of time putting these tenders together, felt very unsure as to what we were being marked on, what was being looked at. We're probably, as a video company, used to being sort of looked at the quality of our work. As a video company, you know, it's quite plain to see a video. So I think we've maybe fallen down with that, but I think the process that we found when we've gone for an NHS contract recently was that we'd be looking at committing, you know, 1 to 2 weeks worth of time, and just found that it was almost a bit overwhelming. And looking at that in terms of what we could do with that time, it almost seemed that it wasn't worth the kind of effort. So we've now looked and sort of made that commitment that we're going to look at external help, and from just a few conversations that we've had, I've been told, you know, there's certain ways in which you need to write things, certain things that you need to sort of tick. And I think that for us as a small business of 7 people, sometimes getting policies and procedures, and as a small business owner, sometimes actually a lot of the stuff that we need to write pages of policies and procedures for, we're actually just doing. And it feels a little bit kind of potentially archaic in the way that it's actually built up.
So what I'm hearing there, Chris, is we know that there's this constant tension between the fact that tendering is a very formal process that requires formal expression of business practices, whereas small firms tend to operate informally, particularly when they're young and particularly when they're very small. So they almost have to invent, really, the fact that they have more formal processes in order to get into tendering. Now, we could go into the discussion of the simplification of tendering, but if we assume for a minute that what public providers are looking for is this idea of social value. They want to see that you're a good employer, that you serve at your community, that you have some sort of environmental commitments and what have you. It feels to me like you could quite quickly develop that library of policies if you were supported to do it. Can you say anything about the value, as far as you see it, of just a flat, or if you even engaging, if you like, digital kind of offer versus a human being coaching, mentoring process, and which you would prefer in your business?
I think that again, although we're a small business, this isn't really anybody's direct role to do tenders, and to actually set that time aside really means a commitment from ourselves to potential opportunity lost elsewhere. So I think, digital platform versus having somebody, what we'd really be looking for is an expert who could coach us through it, probably one-to-one or with myself and another member of the team, because I feel like there'd probably be definite benefits of having a digital platform. But I think with something like this, it is kind of critiquing how we're writing. And as you say, like, I'm sure, we've got really good links with the University of Salford from an employment perspective, plus work that we've helped them with. We've got a lot of volunteer organisations that we've been involved with. So we probably have got that sort of stuff in bucket loads, but it's having somebody who has, I suppose what we'd be looking at really is paying for the expertise of somebody that's actually done it previously versus having to make, I imagine, for a digital platform to commit to the amount of time that it would need to really understand all these intricacies. It's similar to commissioning a video. You could go out and buy a camera, but what you'd be paying us for really is that expertise of how to actually do it and do it in a day as opposed to doing it in a month. We
know that a lot of small firms just buy in a tender writer. What we're nervous about, or we don't think that's an ideal solution, we believe it's only a partial solution, because it doesn't necessarily take you on that learning journey. Because once you've developed, for example, your library of policies, they don't necessarily stay static. And also, hopefully, we'd like to think that they actually made some difference in the way that you actually run the business. That's what business support and policy makers would like to hope. But also the whole process of every time you're looking at a tender document, having awareness that you could orientate your resources in different ways. You could alliance with this person and that person. You could draw on something you've done in the past. We found that all of that knowledge isn't necessarily available to a tender writer who's quite kind of distanced from the business. So even if you buy in a tender writer, we think that building leadership capability to understand tendering and to manage a tender writer is really important in a small firm. So therefore, capability remains an important kind of element. I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't want to come across wrong, but I feel like for us, it would be the idea that we do want to improve, but every time that we've come to write a tender, it has been kind of starting from scratch and trying to kind of cobble together bits and pieces from a range of things. And I think that what we're sort of at the stage of now is that kind of commitment to actually, it got to the stage last time we went for an NHS contract where we sort of looked at it and said, are we going to try and do this ourselves, or are we going to try and the question that we did have from the outset was who can assist us and help us and bring us along on that journey, as opposed to who can do it for us. Because I think, as a business owner as well, I don't want to have somebody sort of dictate kind of that whole section. I'd like to have input myself or with the team as well.
Yeah, and the whole point of us talking about dynamic capabilities, the learning that goes round, is that this becomes more efficient. So that, for example, in really practical terms, small firms that we saw had a Monday morning meeting where they evaluated tenders. The leadership team sat down and they had a really good way of triaging those opportunities, working out what they could go for and what they couldn't go for, what they wanted strategically to go for. That was a really quick way of making good quality decisions. They also, if they put a policy or particular statement about something in one bid, they put that back into their library so that it could be easily accessed next time. So some of these kind of quick tricks may make winning a stream of tenders, because we think that your first few tenders are very costly, partly because you may fail. And obviously I can see with a business like yourself and like most businesses, there's a bit of confidence raising needed to believe that you can build this fairly mysterious thing, which is capability to tender. But what we're saying is that if you persist with it, strategic commitment, then potentially you can develop a really efficient and therefore more productive stream of tenders, a stream of business with the public sector, and make that a specialist part of the business, I guess. And that's part of what we're arguing. And that's why we see the learning journey not just being about becoming tender ready, but becoming better and better and better at tendering. I'm going to move, thanks for that, Chris. I'm going to move now to Peter. Ask you first, Peter, from the point of view of Step Into Healthcare, can you just tell me one thing that you feel Step Into Healthcare is doing really well, that you're particularly proud of?
I think they're, it's focusing on a specific sector and a specific area of that sector, which is to help businesses get into the NHS. So that's its real focus, and I think that unique focus is its real strength, because everything of the whole program is built up on that particular focus.
I think that's really right, Peter, that often a sector-based approach can be powerful. Thinking about the Greater Manchester ecosystem, what do you take away, do you think, for the growth company, for the LEP, to think about from this project in terms of the way that we might do things a bit differently?
Yeah, so I think it's one of the things from your research is, and it is reflected in the Step Into Healthcare as well, it's this idea that it isn't just about the writing of the tender. And I think all of the business support programs need to recognise that to help businesses get into a public sector, you've got to cover that wide range, for everything from the market, strategy, etc. But from us, within the growth hub and the growth company particularly, we are so tied into the industrial strategy locally, and therefore our stakeholders are really across the board. It's not just the businesses, it's not just GMCA or the local authorities or national government, it's all of the stakeholders, like Marilyn's organisations. So the evolution of what growth hubs will end up doing over the next few years will take those sort of take that focus. So, for example, there's a drive from GMCA now for social value and social enterprises, and that will actually colour very much the sort of support that's going to be needed. There's an immediate need for businesses coming out from COVID, so that the growth hub and the provision from the growth company has transformed really quickly to deal with that and what will become new normal. And we will always respond in that particular way. And I think the lesson that I've learned since I joined here in 3 years is, as things are moving, you look as far forward as you can, and business support provision needs to reflect and be positioned to actually benefit the economy as closely as you can as it evolves. And that's from Brexit through to coronavirus, through to social enterprise, the involvement of BAME. Whatever the economy needs to do, we should be supporting it.
Yeah, I mean, one of my concerns about COVID, and with hopefully not austerity, but no doubt spending budget pressures in public sector organisations, is that what we're going to see is a logic of bigger tenders, taking fewer risks, rather than the logic of let's get the double benefit of getting our local citizens engaged in civic and economic activity through the way in which we commission, and therefore achieve the other aims of the local authority, the other aims of the NHS, etc. I mean, I know we've got a lot of anchor institutions in Greater Manchester doing good place-based thinking about that prior to COVID, but I do think we're going to have to watch this kind of other logic, which may start to squeeze small firms increasingly out of supply chains. I
think you'd agree that the place-based thinking does really drive along to looking at the communities that are affected by any change in the economy. And certainly since the Mayor came in, that's been a genuine focus for the whole of GMCA, to try and focus our support where it is actually needed, which is obviously outside the city centre, looking at penetrating different models, and I'll be very happy to talk to Marilyn later to see how we might take advantage of her communities and her networks.
So I think we might be talking about the skills of business advisors. Would you agree that we need some business advisors that are better skilled or better tooled up, maybe with diagnostic tools and what have you, to be able to support tendering?
We always need to improve business advisors, not because they're not good business advisors, but because things change. It's really challenging. Having worked with BAME businesses, it's a genuine challenge to understand how business works in a different community. And my past experience of doing that has always been to work with partners. And I do think that we all need to learn the best practices, but not within the growth company necessarily. Some might be, but an awful lot of best practices are outside.
But also just thinking about tendering itself as a form of capability and raising some small business owned advisors to have some specialist understanding of how to support tendering.
I think it's a leading question. I would think it would be an advantage to have as many people specialists in that. The big thing though that I've found from when I've been advising businesses on tendering is I've done it an awful lot, and it's that practice and experience that comes through. So I think we need to, it will be helpful, but I do think you need to get people practicing and learning. That's
right. I think we need to be quite careful about who's supporting tendering, don't we, and how we develop those skills and spread them out. As well as potentially having some more specialist services like Step Into Healthcare for other sectors that would support firms.
But I think the thing with tendering for me is it's never just been about the tender. There's so much in there that isn't about the paperwork. And even down to how you express yourselves is a marketing issue, or a sales issue, or a communication issue. And I do think that there are skills within the advisors that fit into that already.
Sure.
And it's understanding that tendering isn't just about writing the tender.
No, and our idea of sort of the preconditions include often that it is about relationships too.
It is, yeah. And
helping small firms to have those relationships, because I think some of them are struggling to work out how to have a relationship with a procurer. We're nearly out of time. It's been a fantastic conversation today. I can see from the chat panel that a lot of people are saying, could we communicate with one another? I think what we'll do, Paula, is send the report out to everybody. Obviously, our details will be on there. We can perhaps also ask everybody if they're happy to share their contacts with one another. Our key takeaway finding is let's keep talking. We hope that we're one of the bodies, and we think in Greater Manchester we're not the only ones. There's a few key people who are really passionate about this, and nationally as well. So let's have a new conversation and new optimism and new ideas around how we can get small firms into public sector tendering to help shield them from this disaster that we're in the middle of for many of them, and build back better society, better economy going forwards. Paula, any last words?
No, just thanks for the chat, especially thanks to the panelists for sharing a really interesting perspectives, and to everyone who's dialed in. Really, let's keep the conversation going. I'll share my email back with the report to you, and then please let's keep talking.
Brilliant. Thanks for your time today. Have a nice afternoon. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.